All right, can we get started?
Yes.
Can you all hear me? Yeah. Awesome. So, a quick introduction about myself and ThoughtWorks. I'm a general manager for ThoughtWorks in ThoughtWorks Singapore. We are an Agile company. We've been doing Agile software development for the past 10, 12 years or so. Interestingly enough, you heard Amir in the other room. Amir used to work with us, and I think he's now working with us again. I just found out today he happens to work in the management office now. And the story you heard from Amir about how we had a failed project and a consultant, Martin Fowler, came in and told us we should start doing Agile and how it would help us. So that's essentially how we got into Agile. We had, there was a leasing application that we're trying to build. It took us 3 years to build it, we weren't getting anywhere with it, and we switched to trying to do Agile practices, and then we came up with all these ideas and all these books that we wrote about it because we learned so much by doing that. And then we started trying to do Agile practices just not for all our delivery work, but for also going and coaching to other people and going and building out software for other people. We've written a whole ton of books around that. We're now in Singapore, trying to work in the Southeast Asia market. We work in both Singapore and Malaysia right now, so far. And we just started about a year ago. And yeah, that's about ThoughtWorks. I've been with ThoughtWorks for about 9 years now. I started off as a developer, played the roles of developer. I was a BA for a little bit. I was a project manager. And now I'm doing this general management kind of role. So, just wanted to set expectations about going in. So, I'm not going to be talking too much about what is Agile in this conversation. I'll be talking a lot more about analysis, just around Agile analysis. Again, I'll draw the line and stop short of talking about planning. I will not talk about release planning. I will not talk about estimating techniques, because that's just too wide a whole conversation to have inside an hour's time. I would try to keep it as relaxed as possible. Have questions, interrupt me. You disagree with me, interrupt me. That's fine. I would much rather have a good discussion than try to get through all my slides. Another thing is, I try to put in as much as I know about story writing. And I think the deck is too long. I'm almost certain that I will not get through all of it. It's probably not 1 hour's worth of material. So there are three things in terms of order of importance that I would like to take away from here, right? Assuming that this audience, you're trying to get a feel about how do you build a product incrementally? How do you think about coming up with requirements incrementally and help developers build minimum viable products? And how do you plan those kind of things out? So that's what I'm trying to focus on. And I would really like you to think about coming away with why we should do it incrementally, what kind of analysis needs to be done in the project, and finally, if we get through the slides, some idea about what stories look like, why is it important to write them the way they should be written, so on and so forth. I will be sharing the deck with the organizers. I'm sure that I will send it out to everybody, so you'll have all the material. Don't need to worry about notes and such. So to get going, everybody must have seen this. Actually, it's really weird. I got this picture and I realized that this doesn't really work. And I found out on the plane last night. I was like, I can't fix that problem, so I'm just going to move ahead and just keep this analogy as if it works. So I'll start off very early. When I joined ThoughtWorks, I asked about what is incremental development, and I was told this story, which is supposedly true. I don't know, probably just an urban myth. It goes like this: that there was a company, a retailer, about 10 years ago, that came to ThoughtWorks in ThoughtWorks UK and said, I want to build an e-commerce site. I know this whole internet thing is big, and I want to see how I can get on this. And our team got together and said, well, you want to be on the internet, so this is what we're going to do. In 1 week's time, I'm going to give you a single static web page, which has your first get a URI, find a hosting service, post the page up, talk about what your company is. They were a well-known brand, so have some branding and all that stuff, and a phone number at the bottom. A phone number where people could call up and say, I went to your store in Kingston and I saw this dress. Can you have this delivered to me? And once it gets delivered, or I'll pay by credit card on the phone or whatever. So the thing is, we had a low fidelity, really low fidelity e-commerce site in many ways, up in 1 week's time. And the next we said, okay, that's great. The next step, how about in maybe 2 to 3 weeks' time, digitize your catalog. They had these brochures, so we scanned them all in, cut out the images, and we digitized the catalog and put it up. So in 3 weeks' time, you had a catalog on site. You could look it up and call and say, I want dress number 37, right? That's better than what we had before. But it was really not the e-commerce site. It wasn't the payment gateway. It wasn't everything else. But it was much better than what they didn't have in it. And the next one, what we did was we allowed them to make selections. And before they called up and we clicked enter, the whole order went to a back-end person. And when they called up and said, I'm order number 37, they didn't have to describe what they needed to buy. They could just give the credit card information, buy it, and move on. And finally, it took us almost 3 to 4 months. Those days it was hard to integrate with payment gateways to finally build out a payment gateway where you could pay online. The point of the story is, in 1 week's time, you had a working e-commerce site. You had a minimal viable product. You were able to prove out the fact that there is somebody in the world who's willing to use the internet to purchase things. You got to remember, this was about 10 years ago, so it was still not a big thing. But that was proved out to the company immediately, and with very minimal cost. And that, I believe, is what makes Agile so powerful. The flexibility we build into the way we write software that lets you change requirements. The Mona Lisa thing is typical, right? I mean, someone comes to Da Vinci and says, paint me a wise picture. I have no idea. This is really bothersome that it's iterative. But yeah, you start off with like a pencil sketch. And you say, is this good enough? Maybe the guy isn't rich. The guy who was Mona Lisa's husband apparently was a rich merchant. If you're not rich enough, you say, that's the best I can do for my wife. I'll present it to her birthday present. Take it back. Maybe you're slightly more well off. You can go back and say something more, put some color in there. And finally, you're rich enough to actually pay for this entire full painting that looks like a real painting. It's Renaissance, all of nice stuff. So what this tells you is, when you build software incrementally, you always have to keep in mind that any given point of time, if someone came back and said, we don't have any more money to continue, you have a product that brings some value to the business. It could be a game. Maybe you're trying to build Angry Birds, and you don't have as many screens, but you have maybe just not as many birds. It's just one type of bird that goes and bombs one type of pig. That's great. But it's a game, and it can go live. And this happens time and again. Very recently, 2 years ago, we were at a bank in Australia. We were building software in this fashion. The CEO got sacked, and a new CEO came in. And they came back and said, we have new portfolio analysis, we're stopping all projects. We were the only project in the bank that said, yes, we were 60% done, but 60% is better than what we have in production right now, and they went live with it. So if you build software in this way, there is always value that you can go live with. Now the next thing is, developers will let you do that. The developer's duty, a developer's job, is to build software in a way that is malleable, that is flexible, that can change. They do that. They write tests. They write, CI servers around it. There's automation testing around it that lets you change the software. But it's the analyst's job to figure out how do you get there. Designing the layers of the onion about how you're going to build this product out. That's the job of an analyst to figure out. And that's what I'm going to be talking about mostly. So I'll just skim through these slides. Traditional waterfall, you go top down. In iterative, we build it out in slices. The idea is that it's 50% done, means you have actually 50% viable product that you can go live with. This is the mandatory agile slide that I put up. I'm just assuming a 2-week cycle. Product backlog comes in, you do a 2-week cycle, you get something out, you learn from something from a retrospective, that's fed back into the product backlog. Alright, so what is traditional business analysis? Talking about enterprises mostly, it's less relevant in startups because you don't have some of these things. You have your traditional enterprise analysis where you look at your enterprise, you figure out what your other softwares are, you figure out where does your software fit into the whole place, how is it going to interact with it. You do requirements planning and management, which is looking at what are the requirements that are highest priority, what goes in, what goes out, what is change management that needs to get done. You do elicitation, you go talk to your customers, you ask them what is it that they want. You do documentation. You communicate the requirements to all the stakeholders. You need to make sure that everybody knows what you're trying to build. And finally, you do an assessment and validation. You do some sort of a UAT exercise, which traditionally this is what we do. And this is what we do in an Agile way. We do exactly the same thing. There's nothing different. It's exactly the same thing. But what we do differently is, in a waterfall way, the analyst is treated as a person who is a messenger, who goes to business, gets data. So typically business comes to you with an attitude that, you know what, I'm really busy. I will give you 1 month's time. Sit down and figure out everything you need to figure out from me. And go away, come back after a year later and show me exactly what I wanted. It doesn't matter that in a year's time I might have changed my mind, because that's exactly what happens. It was recently at the bank in Singapore. They built this product for a year. They go out to Hong Kong to deploy it. And the business people who, even though had signed off on requirements, came back and said, what the hell is this? Now you don't really realize all this has changed. You never came back and checked with me. This is crap. I don't sign off on this. And that happens all the time. It's because you treat a BA like a person who goes back and forth between business people and the development team. And in waterfall, it's just pretty much a one-time exercise. The BA goes, becomes SME, becomes a domain expert, comes back and defines requirements going forward. In an agile way, we treat the BA as a bridge. He helps the developers go talk to the actual business people. Why do you need that? One, because business people are busy. They have a full-time job in which they're actually running the business. On top of that, they're trying to find time to come and describe what is a new feature that they need, what's a new product that they need to work with. They can't be sitting with the development team all the time. There is time limitations around that. Waiting for some developer to have a question to answer. So they would like to have a proxy. Secondly, the developers themselves have, if most of you are developers, you understand the fact about having context. Right? You're in the flow, you're building software. You're thinking about how to make software flexible. You're thinking about how do I write my test, how do I design my software to do something. And then you have a question. The worst thing you have to do at that point is to break out of your context, go back, switch context, because most developers, when they're working in that flow, are fairly antisocial. They're working with their pair, that's great, but they're not the best in terms of going and getting an escalation. It's a different type of skill set, mindset you need to go in. They will have to break that, go to business, re-engage with them, get meeting times, sit down with them, talk to them what their problems are, understand something, and then come back to development. Those kind of context switches are terrible for developers. It just breaks your flow. It's not the best thing to do. What you much rather have is, you have a developer focused on building software and have someone sitting on the table with him who can quickly answer this question. He says, hang on, you want me to do this as 5%? Does it like 1 month onwards, or is it after the 0th month? I mean, just give me a quick answer and just build a software and move on. I don't have to break my flow while doing that. And that's the kind of bridge a business analyst in an agile world serves. So how do you do analysis? So one of the biggest problems that people keep talking about, why is this, agile analysis any different from what we do typically? One thing is, we do follow the manifesto where we believe in interaction over documentation. We believe in people over process. We don't sit around with business people telling us, send me an email or a 50-page document telling me what your business is. I mean, that's very common in banks. You do have people sending you these yay-thick documents. Here's the requirements, go run with it. You don't do that. You say, how about you chuck the document, you come into the room, just sit down in the room with 5 other stakeholders within your group, and let's all talk about what we're trying to build. It's surprising the bandwidth, the fidelity and the bandwidth of a conversation as opposed to a document or an email that's being sent. You'll be surprised about how much gets done. And you'll also be surprised about how far away even people who are working together very closely are about a specific point. So we try to do facilitated sessions to get the data out. We ask questions, and the other thing is we do big visible charts. Once we understand what's going on, we draw it out, we make sure people know what it is that we're talking about, and put it up so that people can either validate it or invalidate it. Lots of times what happens is we have these big visible charts in our teams, and there might be another executive or someone who's been working on a project but not with us, on a different project but knows the domain, walks past, has a look at something and says, you know what, that's actually wrong, that's not how it really does it. It's good to have that visibility. It's better to fail and fail fast than to not know and fail at UAT. Yeah, it's again the same idea of having collaborative requirements gathering. We do a whole bunch of these things in terms of whiteboarding index cards. I'll quickly walk through those. Whiteboarding is like awesome because you get people in a room and start drawing things out, and that really draws out what needs to be figured out. It's a very quick way of telling us and visualizing what is it that we're trying to build. And what we typically do is we'll take photographs of this. We may or may not bother to convert them into visual diagrams. We'll just take the photograph, shove it into some sort of a repository and tell the developer, hey, go look at that link over there. We do a lot of these paper prototypes. This helps us a lot, especially on websites and Androids and those kind of more front-endy kind of software as opposed to more of banking software. It helps you where you can actually draw things out on pieces of paper. People can look at it, approve it, say that that looks good. And many times we never bother converting this into a better fidelity. We just give it to a visual designer who creates the assets and we just build off of this. We do a lot of index cards. I will talk to you about why an index card is interesting, which comes out to later on. Alright, so that was in terms of the high level as what kind of analysis techniques we use to get our heads around this. What I want to talk about now is the layers of the onion. As I told you, you need to build up the fidelity towards a software that works. But you're not trying to build, you're not going in and trying to build a Taj Mahal when you start off. You start off with saying, I want to build something small. But that you need to understand, when you're trying to do that, like if you're trying to build an e-commerce site, you have to understand what was the business goal. And it helps to get that 35,000 feet view of saying that this is the landscape I'm working in, and these are my high-level goals of what I'm trying to do. So I do understand that when you build software, software requirements change. You can't be in a situation where someone starts off building an e-commerce site and then stops midway and says, you know what, I'm just going to build a Flash game. That's not it. That's not change. That's just crazy. What you want to do is it's fine to say e-commerce site, but am I going to be more like eBay or am I going to be more like Amazon? They're fundamentally different in many ways. But they both are sort of e-commerce sites. So what we do is we have a whole bunch of techniques called, we get the executives in, we ask them for vision statements. We also get them in and talk to them about an elevator pitch. If you were an executive and you're trying to pay for, let's say you're paying $5 million for this project, and you're in the lift with a board member, you have 5 minutes to tell them, or less than 5 minutes to tell them what this project is about. The board member says, I just want to spend $5 million on something, what's it about? Can you describe it in 2 minutes? Can you quickly tell them what's the value that it's getting? Maybe you're, we recently built a software for a bank where they build currency sweeps in the sense that you can have, as a high net worth individual, you can have bank accounts in different countries or in single countries, but you can hold the money in different currencies. Based on which currency is the best for you, it automatically sweeps it between one currency type and the other. It's a forex exchange plus a bank account. So that's an elevator pitch. Talks about the value, board member gets it, you know why I'm spending $5 million, that's great. The other one is product box. What we tell people is, when you're building a product, can you describe it as if it was a boxed product? Maybe it's your headphones, maybe it's a Windows phone, or maybe it's some sort of a medication. Can you describe what the features are, what goes in, what's the value of buying that, what would go on your box of that product? Like, we recently built a software for a company called which does product comparisons. A box for that would sound something like, it helps you do product comparisons, get you the best deal for cell phones, right? That's a product in the box. Similarly, we talk about roles and goals. We talk about which are the users using it and what are their goals, what are they trying to achieve. Context diagrams, high-level domain models. As we go down, it gets into more higher fidelity in terms of how do you describe what is it that you're building. So that's the first cut. We typically start a project off with what we call an inception, or maybe even an envisioning exercise. What I spoke about last was an envisioning exercise. It comes up with, it probably is very short. It's a week long, maybe 2 weeks long. It tells you what's my vision like. The next one is more in terms of an inception. It's great to come back. Let's say an executive tells you, that's great, what are you building? I'm building a currency sweep application. Fantastic. But he wants to know how much it costs. At least I understand you can't go back and say it's going to be $35.75. You can't get to that level of accuracy. But most executives want to know whether it's 1 million or 7 million. They want to know, is it in the 100,000s or in the millions? It's good to have that sort of a sense. And that's what inceptions give you. They give you that range in terms of What am I trying to build? How will it fit within the ecosystem? What is the estimates around that? So for that kind of an exercise, that probably takes, the envisioning probably takes a week or so to get done. This probably might take another couple of weeks, maybe, depending on how big the project is. And compare this to typical, a project which takes 2 weeks of inception, in a typical traditional way would have probably taken multiple months of requirements gathering. So this is still in many ways much shorter than what you traditionally do. So what we do in this inceptions are we understand business needs, we drive out features, we drive out epics, data models around it. We might do some spiking and architectural spiking to figure out will the solution actually fit. And finally, once you have an inception, you have a plan in front of you. I'm going to actually skip the whole planning exercise, but there is a plan. Assume there's a plan somehow, which talks about, here are my things I'm trying to build, and I'm going to build it in this way. You pick up the highest priority features that need to be built, and again, you're prioritizing based on how to build a minimal viable product at all points. So you break your releases up in such a way that you have a first release sorted out saying that this is my minimal product. You pick up the most highest priority story, and then you do the more detailed analysis around it. What does it look like? What are the features? What error messages will it show? But it's only for those few stories. And then you keep building it up incrementally as you go. Questions? So, like Amber mentioned, we do just enough for our developers to build software out, and we don't do anything beyond that. Because of this whole concept of what we believe is waste, doing over-analysis is fundamentally wasteful. Because imagine you're trying to build, let's say, currency, I'll keep going back to this currency thing, right? Or let's say you're building some sort of an insurance application. You come up with requirements and saying, I'm going to build an originations application which lets you buy insurance. Great. And then there's a renewal aspect to it. You spend, let's say, first 5 to 10 months, or let's say 3 months, building out the creations. You're a new user, you come in and you buy insurance. That's great. But then you've done analysis in the beginning for the renewals. What happens 3 months later if the law comes in which says you can't do renewals in one way and you need to do it differently? Right? Laws change all the time. So you just wasted all that effort trying to figure out how renewals work and try to write all the documentation and capture the data that you capture. It's a waste of time. Better not do it. You need to have an idea that you will have to do a renewals bit or feature later on. You need to have some sort of a ballpark cost of what it's going to be. But you don't need to know the details until it's much closer to building it out. So yeah, this again is just about the just-in-time. You identify an idea, you discuss its potential, you estimate it, you model it, and you prioritize it, and it goes right back into the backlog. So this again talks about how your stories are. The ones right in the current iteration have a much higher fidelity. They're much smaller, they're workable, they're much higher fidelity. The next iteration stories, the requirements are much more high-grained. They're much more larger grained in terms of what they need to look like. And the ones in the next releases and the highest ones, you just have a general sense of what you're going to go towards. You don't really care about how it's going to work out. Alright, so like I said, the 3 things we wanted to take away from here is why do you want to do incremental software development, and general idea of how much analysis that needs to get done before the project gets going. It's not much, just enough to get going. I'm going to now dive into a lot more around just user stories, talking about crafting user stories. Actually, one of the reasons I gave this talk, I wanted to give this talk, was because I was working with one of my clients in Singapore, and the client was great. I mean, they were doing a lot of agile practices, they were having great, and they were doing continuous integration, all that great stuff. They were even writing user stories. But their stories were so huge, it was nearly impossible for them to estimate. They were doing it in a way that becomes very difficult for them to estimate it and get it done within iteration boundaries. And it was causing all kinds of problems. It was causing all kinds of problems when trying to release software. For instance, their user stories would be fix all the auditing or fix all the logging in the whole application. This application is very large. It's a fairly large banking application. And if you're trying to go and say fix all the logging, that's massive. And how are you going to test something is all the logging being captured? It's really hard to work with those kind of stories. And it's important to then craft the stories right for us to actually do this incremental development. So quickly, just back to principles. It's continuous delivery is valuable software. So one thing that I didn't talk about too much is the idea that continuous delivery. That lots of people tend to build software in an agile way, and they'll build it out and they'll have this big bang release after 4 to 6 months. What we strongly recommend people to do now is to try to get software out into production or into beta testing or into UAT on an every iteration basis. And I would strongly also recommend having 2-week iterations. I know there are people who do 1-month iterations. 1-month cycles are very large. You don't get feedback as fast. That's just my personal opinion. I know there are a whole bunch of people in Scrum world who don't like that. But a 2-week iteration is just the right size if you're starting off to get feedback immediately. If you're working in different sort of languages, you're doing, let's say, Rails, which is a much faster language development. You probably a 1-week iteration is great in those kind of environments. But 1-week iterations tend to be quite. It's great for smaller projects. But they have a sense of like a sprint-like feeling as opposed to more like a marathon. A 2-week has the right cadence for that. So every 2 weeks, you need to try to go into production. Put something into maybe a UAT, get it into the user's hands for them to start being able to use it. And for that, you need to be able to define stories that add value every 2 weeks. So first thing, a user story are 3 things. It's a card. There's a very good reason why it has to be a card, but it has to be a card. The idea that a requirement should be able to fit on one small index card size thing, which I have right here, should be bigger than this. And it's a conversation. It is just a placeholder to remind you that you need to go talk to somebody about something. It's a placeholder which says, remember to look at the booking logic or the booking business rules around Sundays, bookings on Sundays. For airlines, that probably is slightly different. They price it differently. It's a conversation to go and have with the business people to understand what that means and how that's going to work. And finally, it's a confirmation. So in an index card, we write the story on one end, on one side of it. We write the stories out on one side, and at the back of it, you tend to write acceptance criteria. That's a confirmation, going back to business and saying, hey, you asked me to build this, and it's going to do all of these things at the back. Are you good for that? So it's a confirmation. Like I said, it's a physical token, and it's very handy in planning. When you have those small little cards, you can actually do trade-offs. You can say that I would like to have this feature in here, but I don't want the other feature. I'm going to put up a separate pile of features that you don't care about. It's a reminder, and it's usually annotated. You have some sort of card numbers, and it usually reads in a way, as a user, I want to do something so that I can get some benefit. We'll come back to that a little later, so why that language has to be that way. So it's a description of the functionality. And all of these 3 things are very important to have. One, as you cannot ever say, you should never say, as a database I want to do something, as a payment gateway I expect something to happen. They are not users, they are systems. You're building software for users. It's fine if, I actually also strongly believe, even in integration projects, try to define your stories in a way that an end user has some benefit. Let's say you're trying to do an integration project where you're an insurance company and you have to send a batch file of all the people whose bank account numbers that need to get paid off for their insurance claims. It's a pure play integration. You create an XML document, you put it on an FTP server, it goes out to the bank reads it, and you can still describe all of that stuff in your story details, but describe the value. Say that as a claims processing officer, I would like to do something so that my end users can get paid their claims that they ask for. So you know what the value is. And if you don't do that, it's very easy to lose track of what's valuable to the users. Lots of times you would end up building software, or developers would come in and say, I want a story to introduce Hibernate. I want to do a different sort of OR mapping. I want to get rid of Hibernate, put IBATIS in there. What's the business value? Right? If the developers or the architect cannot articulate that, there is a reason to question it very strongly, because even valuable doing that. Right? And that's the reason. You should have the motivation. So that is probably the most important thing. If you can't define, let's say I want to have a forget password link. So why? Why do you want that? Oh, because people can, get their passwords if they forgot it. Or they say, I want a login screen. Why do you need a login screen? If you can't define the value of that, you say, well, it's just like you're a news site. Why would you need a login screen? Are you payword? No, you're not. Maybe that's not the most important thing to build it. You don't care about a login screen. Let's build that last. The next thing is about a conversation. So what happens is it reminds you of the conversation that you had. It will then remind you of the artifacts you created during the workshop, so you can go back to. Sometimes you don't remember what the details were. It helps you go back to the business user and say, hey, a month ago you talked about this. What exactly is this about? Get me the details. And finally at the back, the confirmation. Amir mentioned this in terms of one of his projects where he said that they had automated acceptance criteria, which is what we strongly believe in. We try to describe it in this given, when, then format. What does that mean? I'll give you an example of what a given, when, then acceptance criteria sounds like. Given, I'm an unlogged in user coming into your system. When I put in my username and password, then I should be an unclick submit. Then I should be allowed to log into the system. The reason it's described in that way is because you can actually automate these tests. The given will tell you what should be the actual base state of your application coming in. Maybe the given could be that I'm halfway through my loan application. That's the given. Given I'm halfway through my loan application, I'm on page number 7. When I enter my address, then I should be taken to another page, or then I should have some sort of verification done on my address. So it tells you the base state. When do I do some specific action to it? So if you're writing a Selenium test around it, you know what fields need to be filled in, and what button to be clicked, what's the action that needs to get done. And then, the then part is what happens. So if you're writing a Selenium test, you set the application up in a given base state, you do the actions that need to be done, and then you actually go back and verify it, saying that yes, did this show up, did this field show up, was this error message showing up over there. So this forces it to be it's a very predicate thing. It's very binary. It either works or it doesn't work. So it works very well for writing automated tests. And most developers enjoy that. I mean, as a developer, I used to struggle with these wordy requirements documents. But when someone gave me the given, when, then, I just knew, like I say, I did this, it does this, I'm done. So that's thinking for me. I don't know how to interpret anything. Yeah, I think I mentioned earlier, don't ever mention things like the system shall do something. Even if it's like the system shall log an error, well, the system doesn't care about an error. As a person who's maintaining the software in production, you care to know what the log says. You care about that. So it's fine, write about it. There are different users for software. Come back and say, a person who's maintaining the software in production needs you to have this error log so I can actually do something with it. The system, honestly, error happens, it's happy. As long as it doesn't crash, it keeps going. And finally, a user story. So what happens is we do have these index cards, but lots of times index cards are not enough to let the actual developers know what needs to happen. It helps us in the planning, it helps us in the conversations. What we typically give out to our developers is we give them a much larger, that's probably a page-long requirements, which talks about what an index card said, what is the feature we're building, talks about the business context. Lots of developers, having a business context given to the developer lets them come up with a better solution. Lots of times. Sometimes a much cheaper solution. Like in one of our cases, we're talking to a business user and she said, I want to have an Excel sheet which shows me all the transactions that has happened. Not an Excel sheet. She said I want an actual web page on the website which shows me all the transactions, which I can sort on and I can filter on and everything else. The developer said, why is she doing this? And we gave the business context that she needs to provide this analysis and create charts, and then she's going to copy paste it into her sheet. And they were like, you know what, that's going to take me about 2 weeks to build. How about I just give her a link which says download as Excel? I'm done. Right? Providing the business context to the developers lets them come up with better solutions. And we give them that in terms of why are we doing this? Where does this fit into the larger scheme of things? Who's going to read this? Stuff like that. Similarly, story boundaries. It's very important to say that you're only building this much part of the system. You need to integrate as far as this. Don't try to worry about things beyond that. Lots of times the story will tend to seep. People will start building stuff that's over and beyond. As an analyst, as an architect, you've kind of figured out the pieces of the jigsaw. You said, I'm going to build this first and then this. Until you define those boundaries to developers, they tend to try to do a good job and then try to seep. So calling that out is pretty important. And finally, knowing when to stop. Don't overanalyze. I mean, you get to the point where you think you're overanalyzing, stop and let the developers just come and talk to you. It's much easier to do it that way. Alright, I have another 10 minutes and I have a bunch of things to cover. I will talk about this very quickly, which I think is important. And then there's a whole bunch of slides which talk about how do you actually define stories. I'll try to cover them. If not, I'm here the whole day. Anyone who's interested can come talk to me. So one of the most important things are, we call this the invest principle about when you write your stories. I'll just quickly breeze through this. So all stories have to be independent. The point of independence is that it actually kind of feeds into the negotiable part. If it's independent of one another, I don't have to say that I have to build X. If I can't build X, then I can't do Y. People should have the freedom to choose and prioritize, say that I want this over the other. Sometimes that's hard to do, especially in this kind of case when you say I'm trying to pay by first credit card, because setting up the payment gateway the first time is hard, it takes time. The second and third time is probably easier. So you can always link them together and then call it out explicitly. But as a rule, that should be exception, should not be something that you always do. Negotiable, things like I want to have a specific format. So what's negotiable here? Is this, in a way, when you go back to business, what if business came back and said, if I remove these details around it, is this story still doable? Will this reduce the cost of the story? That's a pointless conversation. You should not be talking about the details as a negotiation point. Whether you want this feature or you don't want this feature. It should be granular enough where you can say that I just want this and that's negotiable. I can either drop it or have it. And not try to munch around in the details. It should be valuable, like I mentioned earlier. Until you understand the business value of it, you'll get lost. Again, it's estimable. Trying to do something like this is mostly pointless. Yes, it's very nice. World hunger, everybody wants to fix it, but yeah, we have no idea how long it's going to take. Small is interesting. I think lots of people tend to forget this. They write stories that say, well, there's a lot of features and I want all of this, and it's an all or nothing kind of an approach. And they are okay to go into iterations with an understanding even before they go in that this will not get done. They'll just say, we'll just hang it over to the next iteration. Don't do that. These things will just, in my life I've done that once and it's bitten me badly. That story took almost a month and a half. In the end I had to just go back to the client and say, you know what, it's not worth the effort anymore. And yeah, it's important to, if you think it's too complicated, you haven't analyzed it enough, you probably want to take the extra time to figure out what is the details of this and make it smaller. If you can't do that, you're probably walking into trouble. And finally, it's testable. It should not take too long. A lot of people come to us. Business does this all the time. I want the site to be responsive. I want it to be fast. What's fast? Is it like if you're sitting in Ghana, is the page load taking 2 minutes? Is that fine? And if you're sitting in, let's say, United States, sitting right next to the fiber link, is it taking a few seconds? Is that fine? What is fast? Define fast. All right. I'll quickly talk about breaking down stories and how do you define a story? I'll just give you quick examples of these different techniques to break stories down into actual smaller chunks, because this being small is quite important. So one of the ways to break down stories is workflow steps. Let's take, for instance, you have a loan origination system. You're going to provide a loan application. This first step, which does, let's say, it takes all this data about your personal information. Second step, it takes your data about your financial information. Third step, I would typically break the story along each of those steps. I'll say, here's a story which takes in all your personal information and then plays it back to you. Does the validations. That's one story. The next one that takes your financial data, then it goes back and makes calls to the back-end banking systems and verifies the data is right. That's a different story. So you break it up along workflow steps. That's one way to break stories up. Business rule variations. This is about look out for, if someone comes back and says, I'm searching for flights, right? But flights with flexible dates. What is flexible dates? What are the business rules around that? When you say I'm searching for a flight, when I say flexible, is it 2 days here, 2 days later? Does it also make sense in Sundays? Each of those could potentially be a story, saying that if it's a weekday, 2 days back and forth is flexible is fine. If it's a Sunday, then it's a special bunch of business rules to ask them that because Sunday tickets are going to cost you more. So try to break those along those lines, along the different business rule variations. Try to break it up around major effort. So it goes back to the credit card story. Doing it for the first credit card is a lot of effort. The following credit cards are not. So don't try to club all the credit cards together because that makes it too big. Try to say that make it work for a credit card in the happy path. That's doable within 2 weeks. And then say make it the same credit card with an unhappy path and then add extra credit cards to it. So there will be multiple stories. So it also gives business a chance to say, I'm fine with just doing Visa, the first credit card, and then ignore everything else. That's the first release for me and that's good enough. That gives them the freedom to do that. Simple versus complex. Yeah, so in this version, what we talk about is do the simple version first, and then worry about all the errors that seem to happen and all the complicated stuff that comes after that. So there's a happy path, and then there is the unhappy part that you need to worry about, the more complicated rules. You can just call each of those rules as separate stories. What you know and what you don't. So lots of times as business analysts, you get stuck in places that this seems big and complicated, and I don't know everything. It's never that you don't know everything. There's a whole bunch of things that you actually do know. You try to pull that stuff out and say, this much I know, and I'll talk about this in the story, this I'll go figure it out later on. But don't try to munch them all together because you're just going to confuse the developers. Operations are another easy way to break stories up. Let's say you're doing a publishing site. There is one to create a document, there is one to edit the document, there is one to delete the document. CRUD is a good way to break stories up as separate stories each. Data entry models, again there's a fidelity aspect. You're building a travel booking site. You can either allow people to just type in the date and have, let's say, MMDDYYY, or that could be a first cut, that's your first story because the date goes in and you can purchase things with it. The second story could be have a little calendar widget, you click on it, it pops up, does a JavaScript fitting in. That's a different story. Again, going back to the point, if the money runs out, you're probably good enough just having an MMDDYY field. It's not great, usability is not the best, but at least you can go live with something. And then you can layer on the fact that I'll give you this fancy JavaScript widget. Yeah, the happy path versus an unhappy path, error handling. So, lots of times what we tend to do is, let's take for instance, you're trying to transfer money between two accounts. The happy path is there's account in money A, there's account, money is there in account, the source account, you move it over, it works fine, great, that's a happy path. The next story could be the unhappy path. What if there is no money in it? So if there is no money in your account, then you need to do a cancelling transaction. Ideally, if the work is small enough that can fit inside the different criteria of your single story, but if there is a fair amount of work to write a cancelling transaction, break it out to a separate story and say that happy path works, the unhappy path will be done the next release or the next iteration. Spike versus implementation. This is from a developer point of view. If the estimates are really large, go back to the developers and ask them what is the spike that they would have to do to understand enough to give me a reasonable estimate, or help me break the story up. Don't just accept the fact that the estimate is really large. That is probably a smell, and it tells you that you need to break the story differently. In terms of one, a spike to understand what's going on, and secondly, how to actually implement the thing. User roles, this is a simple one. Having stories around, again, a publishing site, you have a story around publishers, you have a story around a person who's a reviewer and a creator. Each one, a reviewer can review the thing and it can either reject it or accept it, but can't actually modify it. A publisher can actually modify the thing. So there are stories for different roles about how the same system will work. Exposed risk. This is another thing that we try to fail fast in any Agile project. If there is something that's risky, inherently risky, you try to do that as a story early in the thing. For instance, there might be some sort of an integration point that you're not sure will work or not. Yeah, one last. Yeah, so there might be an integration point that you're not sure if it's going to work or not. What you tend to do is you write a story to say, make a quick transaction across this integration point, prove out the fact it works. And then we can add on the further transactions on top of that. So you expose your risk early and try to solve it. And performance. So we have this thing. First make it work, and then make it work fast. Don't try to do both at the same time. I mean, it tends to get very complicated. It adds a lot more complexity to it. For instance, if you have a specific page load time that's needed, or there is a specific transaction has to happen fast enough, you say, get the transaction going, and then you say another performance story saying that the transaction should be working at such and such speeds. That gives you time to go back and tune your SQL, go back and see if you can minify your JavaScript, whatever else you have to do.
I have a question about breaking down by workflow step.
Yes.
After you break it down, do you still keep the card that like reflect the full workflow?
So, I mean, I would imagine that what typically happens is when we do break it down on workflow steps, as an analyst, I would say that here are the first 2 stories of the workflow, and I'll tell the developers there are this many more coming up later on. So they have a sense that this is going to hook up into something larger. They have a sense that they need to have a session that maintains this across the workflow. So they clearly, when they build it out, they won't overbuild it, and these workflow steps will be built in the next iteration or so. It's not like I'll do something now and I'll come back after 6 months for the next 2 parts of the workflow. You would kind of sequentially build them out. So you give them a preview, but it helps them do one bit of work and test it and close out that bit of work inside the iteration boundary. So the whole idea of writing these stories in this way is not letting seepage into next one. The hangover is actually a terrible thing to happen. That destroys lots of Agile projects. When you hang over stories between iterations, that's not good. I mean, that has all kinds of problems. So that we try to say that here's one part of the workflow, let's finish this. It's easy to test. I can actually write mocks on either end and make sure it works, then I can do the next one, then I can do the next one. And I'll continuously integrate it to make it work. And there will be refactoring effort that might be needed, and that's fine. Right? So, yeah, so I'm almost done. So what are the techniques we use? So we use a bunch of techniques like writing mock-ups and technical specifications. This doesn't actually replace the need for a good user story, but this can be supportive of that. And finally, you need to have constraints. Having constraints is a good thing because it lets you define what an actual story is going to look like and what it works. NFRs are usually described as constraints. And yeah, we'll have documentation around how stories are managed, but documentation is not the point. It's just something that that you do for something that you need. You don't do it as an end in itself. It's just a means to communicate what you're trying to do. And finally, there are really no best practices. It's just whatever tools work in whatever place. And yeah, most of this content came in from Brad and Sean's stuff, and I took a few things from Jeff. The Mona Lisa. I'm going to go back to him and ask him whether we do the whole mirror image. Yeah. Questions? Yep.
So when you work on your project, does the product owner join with your conversation while you're working? While you create the user story?
Yes, yes. We work very, very closely with the product owner. Product owners would, typically what happens is, they're in the inception part, they're always involved with us all the time. And then as and when we build it out, I will probably take 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the evening as a product owner every day. Maybe half the time is what they spend with us. But it then lets me go back and do my stuff, go back and say, I heard what you said in the morning, here's what I'm building out, this is what I'm going to tell the developers, does it look right for you? And I also will always encourage the product owners to work with the developers, be in the room to talk to them and answer questions.
So they know the progressive of your project?
They know the what? The progress?
The progress of your project.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, product owners, I call them in for my stand-ups. They know what's going on a daily basis. They have to know what's going on. I mean, you can't have product owners building pie-in-the-sky ideas when the team's not actually going anywhere. Or sometimes the team's actually going really fast and they're not being able to generate ideas fast enough, like Amir mentioned. That's not uncommon. I've seen that happen 2 or 3 times.
As the role of the BA business analyst, we say that we just prepare the enough information about the story for the developer to work. What is the criteria to say that this is enough?
What typically happens is you start off, you tend to overanalyze, and then you give the developers a lot of information, and that doesn't, and they get the job done. what I typically do is I kind of withhold some more and see how far they go, withhold some more and see. So the thing is developers are smart. They learn the domain pretty well as they go. They would need lesser, as in when the project progresses, they can make their own decisions. And you don't need to specify as much. And there will come a time when the developers will ask you something and you don't have an answer for. You clearly have gone to the part where you do not have an answer. So that's always going to be like a sine wave. It's going to dampen over time and go back and forth. Questions? Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.